fact, there are millions of people all over the world right now who are living with the consequences of this. And what's even more startling is that there are people here in this country, here in the city, within walking distance of this building, who find themselves in this horrible predicament. So it's kind of one of the reasons why I wanted to host this today, is to better inform people. And I really want to get more people interested. About 80% of this battle, quite frankly, is just awareness and being aware that it's out there, because it sounds so horrifying that for most people it's hard to imagine it can be possible. And so my hope is that we can create more awareness, because awareness begins to lead to prevention here in domestically. And the better we do with this issue domestically, I think the more credibility we have around the world to speak out on it internationally. So we've got our excellent panel of folks that have volunteered their time to be here and speak to you, and I'm just glad you guys came. I'm excited about it. Our office hopes to take on a bunch of new allies. I know some of your offices and others have really invested a lot of time in this already before we even came here, so we're excited about working with everybody on it. And really just honored you guys would come by. And I'm sorry I'm always in a hurry, but you guys get it. It's an interesting place. Anyway, thank you guys so much for what you're doing and do, and we look forward to working with all of you on this in the future. So thank you guys. Thanks.
Well, thank you, and thank you to Senator Rubio for stopping by. He was one of the early sponsors of the End Trafficking in Government Contracting Act, which is it's a great way to show how government is also being very wary and mindful of their own supply chains and how trafficking and slavery is involved in government contracting. And it's a good springboard for us to talk about how businesses are also becoming involved and becoming more diligent about their supply chains as well. Thank you everyone for joining us here in DC, and thank you for everyone that's joining us through the web. I'm Ambassador Mark Lagon, so I'd like to welcome you. I thought I'd get away with that, but I can't clearly. My name is Samir Goswami. I'm a big fan of Ambassador Mark Lagon. He was supposed to be our moderator today for this panel. However, he is right now stuck in Chicago trying to come back from Montreal to DC, and his flight keeps getting canceled. So I'm sure he sends his regrets, but I think he's at the bar at O'Hare Airport enjoying himself as well. Maybe he's online watching this webcast as we speak. Thank you again for Senator Rubio for hosting this panel today, and all of our panels for joining us. Also, a very special mention to Senator Cardin for serving as an honorary co-host of this panel. And we'd also like to thank Emily Sekine, I hope I pronounced that correctly, and Maggie Doherty, both on Senator Rubio's staff, who I'm told have been just great to work with and instrumental in work around anti-trafficking issues as well. Also, thanks to Catherine Beamer and Debbie Yamada with Senator Cardin's office. And thank you, Humanity United, for sponsoring the webcast so that folks throughout the country can see this. We are here primarily to speak about House Resolution 2759, which is the Business Transparency, it's a Business Transparency Act, and it's modeled after the California Supply Chain Transparency Act that went into effect earlier this year, which simply states that in recognizing that right now we have about 21 million people in the world who are enslaved, who are in forms of modern-day slavery. And they are working in factories and mines and plantations and farms, and the products that they produce, the results of the labor that they use, ends up in the goods that we buy as Western consumers. So the California Supply Chain Transparency Act was a recognition that we still, 150 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, we still have an issue of modern-day slavery, and we as government and as business and as consumers can do more to make sure that the goods that we consume are free of child labor and forced labor and traffic labor. And all it does is it lets companies, incentivizes companies to put on a prominent place in their website to show what proactive measures they're taking, if any, to eliminate child trafficking, slavery, and modern-day slavery from their supply chains. And then it allows consumers to decide what conversation they want to engage in with those businesses that they patron, and encourage them to be more proactive or thank them for being very proactive about eliminating slavery and trafficking in their supply chains. Are we doing the video? We are going to start off, before I introduce the panelists, and we have a great panels today, with a video that was produced by Free the Slaves that'll give you some more context about this act and then gear us up for our conversation.
One of the things that's important to know about slavery is that it never went away. We sometimes think it stopped in the 19th century, but it didn't. There are about 27 million people in slavery around the world, and they're caught up in all kinds of harsh, ugly work. And some of that work feeds commodities and raw materials and agricultural products into the global economic system. We've got to do everything we can to make sure that that slavery doesn't reach into our lives and touch us. Through the things that we buy and sell, the things that we produce, and the things that we use. This isn't a gotcha game. This isn't anybody being guilty. It's about all of us wanting to take responsibility for making sure that the things that we use and enjoy in our life are actually free of that ugly taint of slavery.
If you go to the mine, it's because you have no other way to live. If I don't work that day, we are going to starve.
I didn't know how to weave, but I was taught by beating me up repeatedly. They beat me up each time I made a mistake.
Life below the slave owners was complete hell. It was certain that they would lock us inside our house and burn us down. They almost did.
They were checking house to house, and this is when they got us. They took us to the forest with them.
Slavery penetrates into lots and lots of products. And I've seen with my own eyes slaves cutting down forests to burn them into charcoal that will then be used by the steel industry in Brazil to make steel, which is then exported to the United States and to Western Europe and made into everything from toys to skyscrapers. I've seen with my own eyes children working in farms in Africa harvesting cocoa and coffee. I've seen mines that had slave workers in them digging up gold and cassiterite and coltan that's used in cell phones. The work is just as dangerous and just as horrific as slavery has always been.
We know it's dangerous work because sometimes a big storm may come and cover the hole where you are working and kill you. I know one boy who died.
We were confined to a room and made to work for 12 hours a day. It was only once in a day that we could go and maybe use the bathroom.
My hand got cut. The owners boiled the oil, closed my eyes, and put my fingers in it.
She would take a little bit of kerosene and put it on my wound and strike a match to it. That would hurt terribly. The wound would not heal, and we were made to resume weaving again.
The slaveholder hired men armed with guns and axes, and they guarded us the entire day.
I was kept in chains. That was the most fearful part for me.
And when I came here, I earned nothing. It was a false dream. In the end, I was here working, and I was a slave.
We can't be the police, but we can be the people who say, we're not going to accept this. If suppliers and businesses in the rich North say we're not having it, we're not going to accept minerals that are touched by slavery, commodities, agricultural products that are touched by slavery, that will echo down the supply chain and make that difference. The fact of the matter is, businesses can be the heroes. the heroes of anti-slavery in the 21st century. A good corporate policy on slave-free trade is going to have 3 key components. Number 1 is transparency. You're going to be able to look at that supply chain and really see what's going on and know that you're getting the full story. Number 2 is depth. It's about working your way down through suppliers of suppliers and subcontractors of subcontractors. And the third part of it is credibility. It's about knowing that the people who are checking up have the expertise to penetrate the lies and the confusion that the criminals who use slave labor are always going to use to cover up what they do. So transparency, depth, and credibility. While there is slavery in commodities and in raw materials, the amount of each raw material or commodity that is actually touched by slavery is so small that the cost of removing that slavery shouldn't actually touch the bottom line. This is the future. The passage of the law in California requires corporations to make a report on what they're doing to clean up their supply chain. We know that similar laws are being considered by other states. We know that similar laws are being considered in the US Congress. And we know that major investors are also thinking, how do we make sure that these supply chains are right before we make big investments or loan money to corporations? This is slavery, and we've got people who are suffering, and none of us wants that to happen. We can fix the problem without blasting the bottom line, and we can make the consumers a lot happier when we do so.
Well, thank you, Free the Slaves, for that very compelling video that shows the global problem, but how it affects consumers and businesses here in the U.S. And I think that today we are going to talk about the Business Transparency Act that has been introduced by Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, modeled after the California Supply Chain Transparency Act. And essentially what H.R. 2759 does is it attempts to federalize the provisions that are already existing in the California Act so that businesses have one set of guidelines to work with and don't have to deal with a patchwork of different state-based guidelines and regulations. So we have a great panel today, and luckily we have enough time, I think, to spend with each one of them to ask them questions and for them to speak as well. I'm not going to go through their bios in that much detail except for a very brief introduction. I will introduce everyone first and then turn it over to every one of you to speak in turn. But first, we have Steve Hytop, who is the General Counsel of the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. And aside from being a very great guy, what Steve does is he works with this coalition of workers and negotiates deals and treaties and agreements with corporations. And many of you who patronize grocery stores and restaurants in the U.S. can thank Steve and his group for ensuring that the produce is sourced from places that treat their workers fairly. So thank you, Steve, for joining us today. Second, we'll have Carol Smolensky, who is the Executive Director of ECPAT USA. And many of you who travel for work or for pleasure and stay in hotels throughout the world can thank Carol and her team for working very closely with the hospitality industry, particularly hotels, in signing codes of conduct to help eliminate child sex trafficking from their corporate venues and their supply chains as well. After that, we'll have Mike Lombardo, who is the Senior Sustainability Analyst and Manager at Calvert Investments. And Mike has been an expert on labor and human rights issues for a long time, and he's using that expertise to really work with investment firms and companies, investment firms that want to invest in companies that are utilizing good practices around eliminating slavery and trafficking in their chains. After that, we'll have Amy Hall. Amy Hall is the Director of Social Consciousness. And when I grow up, I want to be the Director of Social Consciousness of something. She's the Director of Social Consciousness for Eileen Fisher, which is a clothing designer that I believe is based out of New York. And they've done some really great work in looking at corporate social responsibility as being about their own operations and working to promote human rights as a business in their operations, but also in partnership with community and NGOs throughout the world. And finally, last but not least, we have Marcus Funk, who is a partner at Perkins & Coie, and his practice is to advise multinational corporations on human rights, sustainability, and compliance, including the California Transparency in Supply Chain Act. Marcus also he's an author on a book about human trafficking, but he also has a lot of both experience at a firm working with multinationals, but also working for government of U.S. government abroad, and as he was working in the U.S. Attorney's Office here in the U.S. as well around corruption issues and trafficking issues. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve to take it away.
Okay, I'm going to ask you to bear with me. I was going to say for a few minutes, but I only have a few minutes. So for a few seconds, while I set some background and try and demonstrate the value of transparency to the overall process of diminishing or eliminating forced labor and other forms of slavery. Forced labor doesn't exist in a vacuum. It can only exist where you have an otherwise debased work environment in which slavery is a thinkable variation from the norm. And that norm will include physical abuse on a regular basis, constant verbal abuse, a devalued and relatively powerless workforce, and most importantly, for our purposes today, a market that asks only whether the product is delivered at the cheapest possible price and on time. Those are the elements that will allow slavery to exist at the bottom of the supply chain. Until recently, those characteristics exactly described the environment and the market for Florida tomatoes. Between 1995 and 2009, there were 7 successful slavery prosecutions by the Department of Justice arising out of Florida, 5 of those arising out of tomato fields. But starting in 2005, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, for whom I work, began to convince large corporations that buy huge quantities of tomatoes that they could do better. Today, we have 10 multinational, multi-billion-dollar corporations as partners with the CIW in its Fair Food program. And since no good deed should go unrewarded, I'm going to name them all. Subway, Burger King, McDonald's, Compass Brands, Bon Appetit, Yum Brands, Sodexo, Aramark, Whole Foods, and Trader Joe's. They have each signed a Fair Food agreement with the CIW, under which they have agreed to make their supply chains transparent within the Fair Food program. They don't go out and tell the whole world everybody they buy from, but we know everybody they buy from so that we can check. They pay a small premium for Florida tomatoes to support a fair food bonus for tomato pickers on the theory that, as you heard in the film, if you're there every day, because if you're not there every day, your family will starve, you will be there every day, regardless of the conditions. But most importantly, what they've agreed to do is to buy only from growers willing to comply with a Fair Food Code of Conduct and not buy from growers who don't. So if a grower does comply, he has access to that portion of the market. If he stops complying, he loses that access. As a direct result of the CIW's agreements with these corporations, in November of 2010, the CIW entered into an agreement, a historic agreement really, with the entire Florida Tomato Growers Exchange to create the Fair Food program. And under this program, the growers, who had been the problem, agreed to abide by the Fair Food Code of Conduct, which requires a number of things. 0 tolerance for forced labor of any kind, 0 tolerance for systemic child labor, a worker-triggered confidential complaint resolution mechanism so violations can actually be brought to the attention of the program, worker-grower health and safety committees to address a variety of workplace issues, including issues like discrimination, stuff that's a little broader than your normal concept of health issues. Worker-to-worker education sessions conducted by my client, the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, on the farm and on the clock so that workers know they are an integral part of the system. That's a critical component. And a worker fair food bonus that I mentioned earlier, funded by the price premium, agreed to by the corporations. You probably gleaned already, transparency is a critical step in eliminating forced labor from supply chains. Forced labor can't survive in the light of day. So the first step is for companies to really learn about their suppliers and for the public to be able to connect disreputable suppliers to products on the shelf. In our experience, only that degree of scrutiny will provide necessary motivation for companies to cut ties with suppliers who may provide a quote-unquote good product, but through labor practices that are or should be unacceptable. Many companies don't really know what is going on in their supply chains. And I would say of those that don't, they fall into three categories. There are those, hopefully not too many, who don't want to know. One large Florida corporation has said publicly, and I quote, "If there are some atrocities going on, it's not our business," end quote. Hopefully that's an extreme. Then there are companies that think they know until they actually look. And they are more than surprised when they find out what's actually going on in their supply chains. But I would suggest that the largest group of companies are those that actually want to know, but they don't know where or how to look to find out. And as it turns out, if we're talking about forced labor, and as the companies that are participating in the Fair Food Program can attest and have found out, the way to find out what is happening in your supply chain is to talk to the workers in the supply chain. There's no substitute. They're there every day. They know what's going on, including whether forced labor is present. And as the Fair Food Program is demonstrating, if the workers feel that they can relay that information without being fired or otherwise retaliated against, they'll do so. They'll do so, I can tell you from personal experience, at 2 o'clock on a Sunday morning. And when they do, forced labor will, not overnight, but inexorably become a thing of the past. Despite all the successful slavery prosecutions that came out of Florida over the past 15 years, not one corporate purchaser of Florida tomatoes stopped buying from any of the farms on which the forced labor was uncovered. Not one. When the CIW focused the public's attention on that sad fact, 10 corporations changed their approach. And that change has led to the growers themselves changing their approach. That is the power of transparency. Even when just 10 large companies are on board. So if you have a statute that requires all companies to begin to look to see what's really going on in their supply chain, that will be the day when we can start to look forward to a time when we can eat produce and use products with a fair degree of confidence that they're being produced without slave labor. 6 minutes.
Yeah, it's all you, Carol.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I now know you know who I am, so I won't introduce myself. I'd just like to start by thanks Samir, and thanks to Senator Rubio and for sponsor Senator Cardin also for holding this hearing. This briefing. This is really important. I'm really happy to be here to support this Transparency in Supply Chains bill. I'm especially happy that it is a bill that calls for both producers of goods and services to demonstrate transparency in supply chains, thereby distinguishing it a little bit from the California bill. ECPAT USA and ECPAT groups all over the world, in fact, have worked for many years and have experience of engaging with the travel industry over protections for children. The experience we have has been positive, I think, for both of us. So let me tell you a little bit about the ECPAT Code of Conduct for the travel industry and how it has gone. I have these brochures that are outside that you can pick up on your way out. Those of you who are not in the room can look on our website, ECPAT USA. The Code of Conduct is a series of 6 steps that companies can take to stop commercial sexual exploitation of children taking place on their premises. The 6 steps are to have a policy against sexual exploitation of children, to train their personnel, to introduce a clause in contracts with suppliers with a mutual policy against sexual exploitation, to provide information to travelers, their customers, and to provide information to local key persons, we call them, to just talk publicly about the fact that they have a policy against it. That section is actually quite flexible because there's so many types of people you can talk to about your policy against sexual exploitation of children. The 6th step is that they have to report to us once a year about how they have implemented the steps. When we begin the discussion with a company, there's a great deal of trepidation. But as the discussion continues, and more importantly, once they sign the code and come to understand how it works, they see it as a positive step for their business practice because it gives them good ways to work, best practices. They get positive feedback, certainly from their staff and also from their customers. Let me just talk about Carlson Companies, which was the first big U.S. company that signed the Code of Conduct in 2004. They're a company that you know their businesses. They own Radisson Hotels, Carlson Wagon Lee Travel, and actually many other brands. Last summer, Deb Cundy, vice president of Carlson, testified at a House committee hearing on human trafficking about their experience with the Code of Conduct, and why they have explained actually why they have now become business leaders against human trafficking. She explained about how in the beginning the code was brought to their attention. There was a lot of discussion internally about whether this was a good thing or a bad thing, and definitely a lot of press back from their legal departments and also from their PR departments that this might be a bad thing. But in fact, they forged ahead and they signed the code in 2004. And really, since then, their concerns have really melted away. And I myself have spoken to their legal and PR departments about how it actually has gone very well. And now Carlson Companies actually encourages other companies to sign it, even helping them with technical assistance and how they could carry it out. They reach out to other companies to sign the Code of Conduct themselves, and informing us about it afterwards. And in fact, in the past year, the logjam has kind of finally been broken, and a number of U.S. companies have started to sign the code, including this year, last year, I should say, Hilton, Wyndham, and Delta Airlines. And pretty soon, Sabre, which is a very large travel company that owns Travelocity, and lots of other behind-the-scenes parts of travel industry work, is signing the code in September. So I say all that just to say that I think companies' resistance to the supply chain bill will give way to their understanding of it as a positive step, I think, if our code of conduct is a model. And I actually think that's what I'm hearing from what Steve has experienced with the tomato growers in Florida as well. Companies, I don't think, will be able to withstand any reputational risk of trafficking, slavery, or other slavery-like practices existing on their premises. And this bill, like our code, gives them a way to stop it from happening. So I'm thrilled about having this bill. I really do look forward to it passing eventually. And I actually look forward to companies recognizing that it is good for them, good for business, good for their products, good for PR for them to actually comply with it. Thanks.
Great, thank you. First, I'd like to thank the host for inviting me to speak here, Senators Rubio, and Cardin, and Attest for all their great work. So thank you. Let me just say a little bit about Calvert before I jump into my comments. For those of you not familiar with Calvert, we are a sustainable and responsible investment firm located in downtown Bethesda, so right within the Beltway. Calvert was founded in 1976, so we've certainly been around for a while. And we manage approximately $11.5 billion in assets under management. We offer a wide range of mutual funds on the fixed income and equity side. And in short, Calvert seeks to invest in companies that we believe are adequately managing their environmental, social, and governance risks and opportunities. We also do a great deal of advocacy, not only through policy making, and I think this is one form but also by engaging companies not only directly, but also through multi-stakeholder initiatives. So if you're interested in learning more about Calvert, please go to our website, calvert.com. I want to highlight two things in my remarks. One, why trafficking is important to investors, and two, what investors are doing with respect to this issue. So first, why is this relevant to investors? We see a number of key risks involved here. So one, there's very much a material risk, if you will. As Kevin pointed out in the film, a great deal of trafficking and slavery takes place at the commodity level, and that can have a number of impacts. It can lead to really supply chain disruptions. It may impact access to capital for companies. So it's very much a material risk. There's also obvious reputational risks. It's sort of the idea of license to operate. A company with allegations of trafficking within their supply chains, that certainly impacts their reputation. It may also impact their access to new markets as well. There's certainly a legal component here with the California law, and I won't go into details, but I think most folks are familiar with that. And also, last time I checked, I think over 125 countries around the world have some sort of anti-trafficking laws in place. So there's very much a legal component as well. There's also a number of other important reasons. Manufacturers, retailers, a number of other companies are already monitoring their supply chains for many human rights risks. So, we see this, we view trafficking as another risk that can be easily folded in. They often have the processes, the systems, the procedures in place. So we don't see this as a great, tremendous burden on companies to add this into their existing processes. There's also an issue around transparency, and again, Kevin pointed that out in the film. We believe that transparency around how companies are managing these issues sends a message of accountability to their stakeholders. And it's also important to keep in mind that investors and other stakeholders are increasingly asking for this type of information. What types of policies are in place, what types of trainings are in place. There's a whole range of issues that we're asking for. And as investors, this is what we base our investment decisions on. So we need access to that information. I would also argue that for companies that are not transparent about how they're managing these types of risks, they may be putting themselves at a competitive disadvantage relative to their industry peers that are disclosing this type of information. So I think that's another key point. I would also want to highlight growing consumer expectations, the Slavery Footprint website. So there's much more access to information for consumers. That information is out there, and consumers are increasingly asking companies, what are you doing with respect to human rights? What are you doing with respect to trafficking? How are you managing these risks? And last, I would highlight international standards and norms. Last June of 2011, the UN Human Rights Council unanimously endorsed the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. And I think within that, trafficking is very much enshrined within the principles that John Ruggie and his team put together. And now that's really the norm for companies. So I think there's tremendous reasons for companies to think about how they're managing these trafficked risks that are very relevant to the investment community. Now let me highlight a little bit some of the activities that we're doing. And we do much of our work in partnership with many other investors. Julie Tanner, raise your hand, Julie, from Christian Brothers Investment Services. We work very closely with Julie. We work very closely with ICCR, the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility. So we work closely with our peers on this issue. And together, last June, Julie, myself at Calvert, and ICCR published this guide, Effective Supply Chain Accountability. It was largely in response to the California bill, but what we've taken is a much more holistic approach. We look at everything from how companies can develop human rights policy statements, conduct their due diligence, their auditing, their training, capacity building, et cetera. So if you're interested, this is the only hard copy I brought, my apologies, but it's available on Calvert's website, I'm sure on Christian Brothers and ICCR. So it's a very helpful guide for companies and identifies a number of good practices of other companies. So that's one piece of great work that we've done. Also, very recently, again, together with Julie and ICCR, we've done some work around the London Olympics. The major sporting events tend to be a hub, if you will, for sex trafficking. So we use the London Olympics as a springboard, if you will. Together, we wrote to a number of Olympic sponsors, I think 21 in total, and that included Coca-Cola, GE, McDonald's. We also wrote to a number of hospitality companies, and really to raise the awareness level and ask these companies, how are you addressing trafficking? What types of trainings do you have in place? What are your recruiting practices? What's your due diligence? As well as how are you reporting on these issues to your stakeholders, to your investors, et cetera. And I think next month, perhaps in September at latest, we will be issuing a short report that will identify some of the responses and some of the strong practices that we've identified based on what we've heard from companies. So please keep an eye out for that. We also wrote to the International Olympic Committee as well and encouraged them to establish stronger guidelines around procurement and sponsorship as well. Another example of the work that we've done, and this is a little bit more on the policy-making side, earlier this year, again, with Julie and ICCR, we worked with USCIF, which is the Forum on Sustainable and Responsible Investment, and that's essentially the trade association for the responsible investment community. And together, CIF with ICCR sent a letter to the House leadership, Speaker Boehner and Representative Cantor, to urge them to bring Representative Maloney's bill to the top of the policy agenda. So again, I think that's a clear example of what we've done on the policy-making front. There's many other examples of the work that we've done. We've really engaged companies for probably something like 20 years on these issues, going back to sweatshops in the mid-'90s in the apparel industry. But we've gone much beyond that, and we've engaged food and beverages and electronics and automotives, because these issues are not specific to any given sector. They really cut across all sectors. So there's plenty more examples I'd be happy to share, but I want to keep this brief, and I certainly look forward to the discussion at the end of this panel. Thank you.
All right. Well, my name's Amy Hall again. I'm the Director of Social Consciousness at Eileen Fisher. I have to say we're very humbled to be invited to participate in this briefing. We never particularly saw ourselves as a leader in this field, but I suppose we do have a story to share, and one that could shed light on what it's like from the inside, being a company that needs to carry this work out. Whether you're in the apparel industry or another industry, I think the work is very similar. For those who aren't familiar with our company, we are a women's clothing company based in New York. We're a global brand. We source our product in multiple countries around the world. We are sold in 58 of our own stores, as well as many major department stores and specialty stores around the country. And when we think of our supply chain, up to a year ago, we thought of primarily just our primary suppliers, which is our cut and sew suppliers and our knitting suppliers. When it came to human rights issues, we really didn't delve beyond that into the suppliers that provide our fabric, or the suppliers that dye our fabric, or the suppliers that provide our zippers and thread and all of that. And all of that is very important. They all have a workforce. So up until about a year ago, we were very happily following a code of conduct that is internationally recognized. It's SA 8000. We were auditing against that. We were training against that, training our suppliers. And then we heard about the California Transparency in Supply Chain Act a year ago. And at first, I know my personal reaction was, oh, we already do so much. this will be easy. And then when we really started thinking about it, we recognized that we had really only scratched the surface. And so a member of my team, Luna Lee, who's our human rights specialist, flew into action and began to survey our supply chain as an initial step to really understand where the risks were and where the red lights were. And what we were looking for was evidence of certain kinds of hiring practices or recruitment practices that might lead to possible withholding of papers or withholding of debt from workers in any country, whether here in the United States or in China, where a large majority of our product is made, or any country. We were looking for evidence of, well, in the case of certain fibers, such as cotton, we did a lot of work around Uzbek cotton issue, which is known for forced labor and child labor issues. And so that started us down the path of a fiber origin. So beyond the survey, we then went into further auditing, really asking our auditors to really focus on human trafficking during the regular audit process, and that included interviewing workers for how they were brought into the factories, interviewing the managers for how they were recruiting people, looking for evidence that the workers had a voice in the factories, should they either witness something that was going on around them or they themselves might feel subject to some kind of trafficking situation. And we then engaged in a process of training. We trained our agent that represents many of our factories in China and India. We trained all of the managers and workers in our China factories around what these red flags would be and what they can do if they run across them. And we raised awareness among various groups of our own employees, including our leadership, senior leaders in the company, as well as our designers and manufacturing team, so that everyone was really becoming aware of how this issue can impact their own work and what they can do about it. We then began to incorporate questions. We're just doing this now in a kind of a survey process where we're looking for what are the practices that our fabric providers, for example, are engaged in around labor, the labor of their supply chains. So that is something that's underway right now. And we have always been a very quiet company. We've been around for 28 years. Very few people were aware of the fact that we upheld certain values outside of just the fact that we make great clothes. So we had to put this on our website, and it kind of pushed us out there in the public, which is probably why we're here today. So we have a disclosure statement. It's out on the table for those who are here in the room, and it's on our website, eileenfisher.com. Beyond that, we have also engaged in funding and raising awareness through our store events, funding for organizations that address human trafficking in different ways. So for us, I think the key to a company like Eileen Fisher with a supply chain that's very complex, multi-layered, multi-country. It's about partnering with the right groups, with the right NGOs, with the right other brands who may share some of our same factories or want to engage with us in some of the work that we're doing. And it's really about building practices into what we are already doing and really integrating this work. It's not hard to do it. It takes some time. It doesn't take a lot of additional resources because we were already engaged in auditing. And this was all started for us by the California Transparency in Supply Chain Act. And I think that if this were made a federal mandate, it would level the playing field for us, and it would really, I think, bring peace of mind to customers, to the consumer who is looking for great product in any category, whether it's clothing or sporting goods or any category, that they can feel good about buying. And this is the way business should be.
Thanks again. My name is
Mark Funk. I'm Urban Studio, and by way of background, the way that we come at this topic, the way I look at this topic, is a lot more
Rarely does someone want to have me speak louder. Okay. So, as a former federal prosecutor, I used to work with the State Department. As a lawyer now at a law firm, we're the only law firm, the AmLaw 100, the biggest 100 law firms in the country, to have a dedicated corporate social responsibility and supply chains practice, which a colleague of mine and I set up fairly recently, about a year ago. And so I come to this topic a little bit with the same, I think the one thing we can all agree on, of course, is it's a huge problem. And that's to say child trafficking, forced labor, human trafficking. These are all huge problems, and no one's going to deny that. And I think the more you get out there, and to your point, the more you actually see these things firsthand, I think the more graphic they become. And I spent 2 years in Kosovo where I worked on trafficking issues almost primarily. And so, this is a problem that we all agree on. I think, and this is maybe where the lawyer part of me comes out, the part that I wanted to talk about is sort of formally I was supposed to address effective business responses to the trafficking issue in the context of the pending bill. And what I'd like to point out are some of the things in the bill, and this is sort of, I'm not trying to put a fly in the ointment here, but I think I can tell you when I deal with clients, when we deal with clients, I've never had a client come to me and say, you know what, how can we get around all these burdensome laws? How can we start using kids more? No, I'm not saying that doesn't happen somewhere, but it doesn't happen with any of the people that I tend to deal with. And so I always start from the assumption that the clients that we have, and frankly, American business and Western business and frankly, business worldwide, there are obviously troubled areas, but that, business people, legitimate business people, the last thing they want, if you're the manufacturer of this microphone here, the last thing you want is to have that microphone made by a child, and no one wants to buy a product like that. So they were trying to figure out ways to do the right thing. And I think the challenge with all laws like this, California Transparency Supply Chains Act is a good example. The Dodd-Frank conflict minerals rules provisions, which are pending right now, supposed to be released maybe August the 22nd. The final rules are us exporting our moral imperatives. And that, depending on how you look at these things, can be a good thing. And I think it's a good thing. But when you look at some of the details of the laws, a lot of you are staffers, which is a great thing. So you're maybe even aspiring lawyers, who knows, or maybe lawyers already. So you're going to look at some of these laws carefully. And I'd urge you to look at these because sometimes you have to put some pragmatism into your view of how these laws work. None of us want, again, to support slavery, to support trafficking. But some of the things in HR 2759 that I think make it more challenging for the business community, even the most well-intentioned person who is involved in this area, the most well-intentioned compliance officer is going to say, it's very difficult for me. Let's say you own a supply company. You own, I'm not going to name any names, but you sell office supplies. Those are thousands, tens of thousands of products. Under the law, you're required to actually make sure that every person who supplies you, let's say this company supplies this pen, that the materials that are put into this pen, that could be the supplier, the supplier's supplier, the supplier's supplier's supplier, the guy who is getting the rubber from the rubber tree, that they are engaging in recruiting practices that are consistent with your policies. Now think about how that would actually work as a practical matter when the product is made, let's say, in China or India. The incredible burden and logistical, frankly, impossibility of some of the requests that are made of business. Another one is remediation. It's a great thing. No one wants to see victims. But if you're a provider of, you're a retailer, manufacturer, or a person who's in the service industry, again, the federal bill expands the reach. You're actually required to have remediation plan for any victim in your supply chain. So that could mean any one of, remember, you have 10,000 products. Let's say each product has 10 suppliers that make the different parts for it, and then they all have 10 suppliers. And if there's any victim anywhere along the way, you're responsible for a remediation plan. In other words, to try to help the person. So there's some practical, I'm just putting those things out there because, and maybe also it'll stir up conversation. I will not get the same wholesome applause, perhaps, although Karen, I'm sure, will applaud very heavily. But I think those are some things that we need to talk about when we think about sort of how do we do this in a logical, good way where we can actually, where business isn't going to come and say, are you crazy? How are we ever going to be able to do that? How can I make sure the training is proper of my supplier's supplier? It's an impossibility. I can barely make sure my trainings in my own factories in China are proper. So those are some of the things, and maybe, again, I'm trying to be the provocateur here, the agent provocateur, but I'm trying to bring those to you because the most well-intentioned, forward-leaning company in the world is going to have a problem doing this, and companies who are more reluctant are going to push back. And so when we think about these laws, we need to also put it in a realistic context. And that's all I've got.
That's
See,
all.
I told you, no clapping. I mean, this is
Marcus. Thanks for being
predictable result, right?
Thanks for being the courageous provocateur, Marcus. Actually, I think that's whoever set the format for this panel did a great job listening to Amy and talking about the positive steps they've taken around human rights in their supply chain and the benefits they're getting from that. And then followed by Marcus talking about some of the challenges that companies might have to the law as written. But I would like to clarify, as I've read the law, might be just slightly different than as you're seeing the law. And I say this as a caveat, until a few weeks ago, I was the director of corporate responsibility at LexisNexis, which is a multinational $6 billion corporation. And it was my job to actually review this law for LexisNexis and advise our government affairs team and others on it. And as I read it, and as I discussed with our procurement folks while I was at LexisNexis, was that it was simple disclosure with a set of guidelines of what things businesses have to consider. Yes, we should consider how our suppliers, what codes of conduct are prescribing that relationship to make sure that children are not in those nodes of the supply chain. And then if children are found in the last tier of a very complex supply chain, what practices would that supplier then have? But it wasn't prescribing those practices. It was saying, if you have them, let the public know what those are, and then let the public will then use that information to make their investment and their buying decisions. So it wasn't a set of mandates or guidelines. It was more of, this is what a good supply chain compliance policy may look like that a business can adopt, and let the public know which parts of it you do adopt, is how I read it.
And I think there's some, I mean, obviously, here again, here's the reality of it. The law says that you have to disclose in your SEC filings what you have done to remedy or address, and then it gives you a long list of issues. All of the ones I talked about, all the ones that Samir talked about. What public company, when faced with that, when given this list, is not going to, because it's a binary decision. You either can say we're doing nothing, right, or you report on what you're doing. And very few companies are going to want to say we're doing nothing about these topics, right, because it's a publicly filed document. So to say it's voluntary, I mean, it's not really voluntary. I mean, no company, no publicly traded company is going to file something saying we're doing nothing about this. We have a mandate to report. And mind you, if you're doing something, right, you have to say what you're doing. If you can just choose to do nothing. So you can't just sort of do it privately and not report on it. So that's why my view of it is a little more, it's true, it's not a mandate in the sense that the law doesn't say if you don't do these things, you're going to go to jail. But it says you have to report what, if anything, you're doing about these things. And again, I think it's, realistically speaking, and speaking from the perspective, I'm sure you've had the same experience, I can't think of a publicly traded company that is going to want to file something that says we're doing nothing, which of course is the whole point, right? I mean, I assume that's the point. So therefore, it's hard to say, well, yeah, we have all these very extreme, depending on how you look at it, we have these very challenging provisions. Some of them are very basic, right? Have a policy and so forth. I mean, very much like ECPAT's guidelines. I mean, they're sensible guidelines. But some of in the details, again, I just urge you to look at the details. There's some very specific demands in there that you have to report on whether you're doing something about this. And it's very hard to imagine, for me to imagine clients just saying, we don't care, we're not going to report, or we're going to report we're doing nothing. I don't think you can imagine that as a default.
So I think maybe one thing that you're not taking into account is the trickle-down effect of the inquiry. In the agricultural business, which is the business that I know pretty well, one can debate whether it was for 100 years or just 50 years, but for a very long time, the concept of a crew leader existed for one purpose only, and that was to put a level of legal insulation between horrible things that were going on and liability by the people who owned the farms. That's why they were created. They had no other purpose. Because when they were created, the vast majority of farm workers in this country were citizens. They spoke English. Now the crew leaders serve a double function. to have that layer of legal insulation and to communicate with the client, because most growers don't, well, a lot of growers don't speak Spanish. But they existed originally to act as legal insulation, and the law still recognizes that. As soon as the 10 corporations participating in the Fair Food Program said, we're not buying your product, if there's any indication that forced labor or child labor or certain other things, those are the only two absolutes that we have, is forced labor and child labor. But for example, if somebody's involved in sexual harassment and the person's not fired, the company loses business. They can't sell to any of our 10 companies. As soon as the companies made that known, that 50 years of effort to put legal insulation there disappeared. And the growers said, we don't care. You do it, you'll never work as a crew leader again. And that will, I can't tell you that will happen in every industry, but that will happen in many industries. That if the ultimate user says, this is the product we want. So if there are 56 layers of suppliers and the widget shows up and it doesn't work, those suppliers aren't going to supply that company anymore. And when we start treating human trafficking in the same way, it won't be perfect, but it'll be an awful lot better than we have now, based on nothing other than the company saying, this is not just that we want this, but it's going to happen, because the first time you smear my brand with your practices, you don't sell that product anymore, at least not to us. And if every company's saying that, that means that person has to find another line of work. And that's exactly what's happening in agriculture, and I can't think of any conceptual reason why that wouldn't work in other industries as well.
Thank you, Steve. I promise we're going to open this up for questions very, very soon. I do want to just round up this discussion a little bit by just mentioning something and then turning it over to someone on the panel. I think the average Fortune 1000 company has about 20,000 suppliers. So and they span the globe. So as you can imagine, it's very extensive. It is actually hard to get to the bottom of a supply chain because you may have 15,000 suppliers in the middle of it. And it's very complicated accessing the data. It's complicated actually working with governments overseas in certain countries where they don't have good data, good audit systems, and good rule of law. So it's very complicated. But on the other hand, the argument then is, well, if you're in the business of making widgets, then you should make those widgets responsibly, and the person buying your widgets should be assured that they're not inadvertently, contributing to someone's exploitation in Ghana or Congo, et cetera, et cetera. And so from what I've heard, that is cost and obviously access to information are the two big barriers to compliance on any kind of supply chain measures or disclosure. But I'd like to ask Amy that you have, as a smaller company that's become a big company over the years, but really based your work on very progressive human rights practices that must have affected your bottom line. All the training you spoke of, all the compliance you spoke of must have incurred a certain cost. And when you look back at that, did that cost, if you did incur it, did that give you a competitive disadvantage or an advantage in the face of consumers who are looking at buying good products?
Wow. It's a little tricky to answer that question. First of all, we do have a very small supplier base when compared to the average that you just talked about. I mean, we have 30 primary suppliers and fewer than 100 secondary suppliers or tertiary suppliers. So it's really small. And these are relationships that we've had for many years for the most part. So we're not rebuilding relationships year after year or really changing things up. We can build on a foundation that we've had going for many years. Having said that, we have been doing a lot of this work way under the radar, and I would venture to guess that most of our customers have not been aware that we've been doing this training and educating and awareness raising and auditing and interfacing with our suppliers for a number of years. I mean, it's probably upwards of 14, 15 years at this point. And so in terms of competitive advantage, I don't think it helped one darn bit because nobody knew about it. And in the whole scheme of things, I would say the cost is relatively negligible. We partner with nonprofits to get the work done and a few key auditing firms. So, however, I will say that having colleagues at really large companies and knowing that they have to pick and choose how they spend their resources, they have to look for the hot zones and the high-risk areas, and that's how they will tackle this, and I think that's very reasonable. I mean, we're doing that on a very small scale, looking for the risks to dive into. So I feel like it is a cost of doing business in the same way that you would build a safe factory. This is building a safe workplace, and to me, there's no difference. You really have to do this if you want to have a future.
Thank you. Unless any other panelists have something to add to that topic?
Well, Marcus, what you're saying is that companies are going to be opposing the legislation because they don't want to take responsibility for what's in their supply chains. I mean, that seems to be the argument that you're saying. And yet you also said that businesses just don't want child labor to be taking place there. That's not, nobody wants to hire an 8-year-old or whatever, that's true. And so, but this bill sort of does imply a convergence of those ideas. You don't want children, okay, prove to the world, how it is that children are not, are not in your supply chain. And that's just really a comment. And my experience, though, with working with companies is kind of the starting position of what you're saying. Oh, my God, we don't want to talk about it. Don't ask me to do anything. I'm afraid of litigation, and I'm afraid of what the public is going to say. And after years of discussion, we do find that because, yes, people do want to do the right thing, certainly by children. And they see that, in fact, that there are ways to do these things that are not scary, that are not going to set them up for litigation. And in fact, in my world, in my code of conduct, that idea has now flipped. That we're talking to companies now who feel that they should sign the code of conduct because it shields them from the possibility that, these bad things are, in fact, might be happening there, but we have now put in place a series of steps to do what it is we can do. Now, maybe they can't do everything, and and again, my code of conduct, it doesn't mean that no child will ever be sexually exploited at the premises of a hotel that signs a code of conduct ever again. That we just know that can't happen. But we do ask them to do everything that they can do. And that's what they're agreeing to do. And I think that that's kind of probably the philosophy behind this bill as well. Do everything that you can do and tell us what you did. And that's what our code of conduct does. Do what you can do. It's not nothing. There's stuff you can do. Do it and tell us what you did. And that's kind of philosophically, I think, what that bill is about as well.
Yeah, and I don't think we have we don't have any disagreement on this. I mean, again, I think your code of conduct is a reasonable code of conduct. It doesn't, it frankly doesn't ask for any of the things that I talked about just now. And what I'm saying is, even if you think these ideas are the greatest ideas, and they may well be, all I'm pointing out to you is good companies want to do the right thing, and when they find out they've got a problem with a supplier, they want to investigate it, they want to find that out. And I think we can all agree that that's the right thing to do. And that's certainly what the law requires, or the disclosure would ask for you to show. What I'm saying is you're going to get some pushback on some provisions. And that's my only point. My point is not, I'm not even making a normative judgment whether that's a good or bad thing. It would be a great thing if every company did all these things and more. But you have to be realistic about political realities, and you have to be realistic about practical realities. And I think as a practical reality, it's going to be very difficult for some of these provisions. Again, the majority of the provisions in the California Transparency Supply Chains Act and in the pending federal analog are things that companies can do. But I'm just pointing out that there's some things that are very just very, very hopeful, and maybe someday we'll be there. But I'm just saying, as you're looking at this law and saying, hey, is this going to pass or not, you do need to take a hard look at that, because, if we're here in a room full of business leaders, you might have more people who think maybe I'm too liberal on this topic or too sort of soft on this topic. I should be fighting harder. But I think you're going to get a lot of pushback on those provisions, even if they're just disclosure provisions, because you're essentially forcing the hand of the companies. And again, good companies want to comply with these provisions. It's just a question of how far can we move.
Well, Marcus, unless we have some CEOs on the webinar, I'm pretty sure no one's going to accuse you of being too liberal in this room. But I do appreciate, you inspiring this dialogue and all the participation from the panel. With that, I want to turn it over to the audience. Are there any questions for these great panelists that we have?
Better assist and guide the movement. So I'm wondering if companies have at all reached out to survivors and heard what they had to say about this issue.
And the question, because I don't think you're on the microphone, the question was that have companies used survivors and survivor perspectives on advising them on some of these issues? Who would like to respond?
Well, I'd say I don't know that any of our small number of companies has done that, although I do see them tiptoeing into the human trafficking NGO world and establishing relationships. And it's possible it's not too far before Delta Airlines invites a survivor to come and speak to their staff thing or their annual thing. I think it's really possible. I say that from the perspective of these companies going from, again, in 2004, I could never talk about this issue, to signing the code of conduct and feeling comfortable around the issue of sexual exploitation of children, that it does happen. We're not accusing them of being the one who started it all, but that there's stuff that they can do. And so I am finding them being more comfortable. I think it's not out of the question.
And I will just add that although in our supply chain we have not actually found evidence of any kind of trafficking situation, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We just haven't found any evidence of it. We actually, through, because of the organizations we fund separately that look into trafficking, sexual exploitation, that kind of thing, many of our stores, some of our stores have invited survivors, victims of trafficking, into their stores to speak with customers and talk about this openly, about their experiences. It is riveting. It is absolutely riveting and mind-changing. And we really, welcome that kind of experience for our staff and our customers because it truly changes your perspective on this issue forever.
And for the 10 companies that participate in the Fair Food Program, I would venture 8 of whom don't realize it. They are consulting on a regular basis with people who have been victims of forced labor because, unfortunately, too many members of the CIW are victims of forced labor. And the process that we use, those people, along with the other members of the organization, are regularly involved in program decision-making. And so, but that really gets back to talking to workers if what you're talking about is forced labor. There is no substitute. Auditing, I am sorry to report, is not a substitute. When we finally sat down with the growers in Florida and they became our collaborators, I wouldn't go so far as to say partners, they would scoff at audits. They would say there's no audit that they couldn't manipulate to have it come out the way they wanted it to. But you can't manipulate your workforce on a daily basis. If it's happening, they know. And so I think, as I said, 2 of the companies are actually aware of that, 2 of the companies that are participating and consider it a value. I would say that the other 8 companies probably haven't thought that through. They think they're dealing with a coalition of Immokalee workers, and of course they are, but they haven't taken the next step to say, and therefore we're actually getting feedback and input from people who were the victims of forced labor.
And that question was asked by Stephanie Richard from the Coalition to Abolish Slavery and Trafficking in LA. And I believe you have a Speakers Bureau of Survivors that does speak on these? You do.
So in addition, we have a group of 30 survivors that have graduated from our programs. If you're interested, please feel free to contact us. We also host the National Survivor Network, which is across the United States. Survivors call in to provide peer support to each other when they want to speak out in this area.
I think it's a very good point that Steve also raised, is that I think a lot of companies face a problem of accessing information in host countries that they're doing business in India, Philippines, Far East, South America. And we don't realize that there are a lot of survivor-led or NGOs in those countries that are working with workers and others that can access information in a trusted way with them. And so there are a lot of relationships in the NGO community that are with survivors that companies can rely upon to access information about what the on-the-ground working conditions are. So thank you for asking that question. Any other questions?
Hi, my name is Piper Hendricks. I'm with an organization that makes documentary films trying to raise awareness of these issues for consumers. And I think it's wonderful to hear what you're doing, everything from the investment side of things to working with the workers themselves and at different levels in the supply chain. I'm wondering if you can address what consumers, the average Joe who's not here in Washington and able to come up in person on the Hill, what can they do to ensure that the message is getting out there and the products that they are using are not part of contributing to the human rights abuses in this country?
I'll talk again.
Please repeat the question, Carol.
What can the average citizen do to make sure that they are not contributing to abuses in the supply chain? Again, I'm going to talk narrowly about the ECPAT's Code of Conduct. We actually have this postcard campaign. When you use any travel company that has not signed the Code of Conduct, you can say to them, I'm your customer and I would like you to sign the Code of Conduct. We have these postcards which are outside. You can sign, and if you don't feel comfortable saying it to them, you can just sign your name on this postcard, tear it off and hand it over and say, this is how I feel. We're also increasingly asking businesses that have large travel budgets to ask their travel suppliers to sign the Code of Conduct as well. I'm sure others have something to say about that.
Well, you can certainly invest in Calvert, and rest assured that, no, and with all due seriousness, you can invest in Calvert, a number of social funds that are advocating on behalf of these issues. We're actively engaging companies, a number of companies across all industries, and how they're managing these risks. So I think that's one way, and I think the average consumer can just, increase their awareness. There's a number of apps, iPhone apps out there that tell you, some information about this. So I think it's just about educating oneself and being conscious when they're doing their own personal shopping, so to speak.
I think that's right. Ultimately, it's voting with your dollars. And we have 10 corporations participating now. I think all of them, and if not the vast majority, are happy that they're participating. None of them were happy to join. None of them joined voluntarily. None of them responded to our first letter asking them to join. None of them responded to our 57th phone call asking them to join. Not a single one of them, whatever their reputation for social responsibility in the world. They all responded to a certain percentage of their consumers, and it doesn't have to be anywhere close to half. Probably doesn't even have to be close to 10%, although in our case, I think we probably started to approach that. When a significant percentage of their consumers say, no, this matters to us, and there, oh, by the way, are other places that sell hamburgers. These companies have brands that they have spent a fortune to build up, and they care about them. And they ought to care about them. And this is not, as Marcus said, this is not something they want associated with their brand. And so when consumers say, what's going on here, that pushes them over the edge to join a program like the Fair Food Program. As I said, now that they're in it, they recognize the value of it, but this was something that nobody had ever asked them to do before, especially not the part where we asked them to actually pay for the social responsibility changes, not entirely, but to contribute their fair share to the social responsibility changes, as opposed to just saying to their suppliers, here's what you have to do, you pay for it. Because that, in our view, is not a sustainable model. So it wasn't easy to get companies to come in. Now that they're in, I think they are sad. I think they made a good business decision. But absolutely, the engine that drives the work of the CIW is consumers.
And I just want to build on both of the last two comments. We participated in a program through Not for Sale, and it's an iPhone app called Free to Work, free number 2 work. We are on it. We are rated, as are many other well-known, better-known brands than we are, around how much voice the worker has, essentially. And so that's just one way, at point of sale, a customer can check out the brand that they're interested in. But I just, I can't really underscore enough the power of social media these days, and All it takes is one Facebook posting, negative or potentially negative, or and it just launches into a mass conversation among interested customers, and you want to get that off there as fast as possible, and it will make us move really fast. So, that's to me, that's kind of where it is right now.
I really appreciate that you asked that question. And when I was at Lexus, we were one of the first co-sponsors of the Business Coalition Against Trafficking, which is a group of 15 multinational corporations that got together and say, how can we together, as multinationals, help government and NGOs in combating trafficking? And in the first few meetings that we had, we'd all go around, and these are all VPs and SVPs, decision makers in their companies. And we all went around and said, okay, why have we, both as a company and personally, become involved in spending a lot of time meeting every quarter, flying across the country to meet about trafficking issues? And I was kind of taking notes on my pad because it struck me that no one said that their consumers had posted on their Facebook or posted on Twitter or even called them or to ask them, I'd like to know about your supply chain, or I'd like to know if your hotel that I'm staying at, has signed the code. No one had ever said that. It was always because one SVP's daughter did a class project, or they saw a documentary, or Senator Rubio, he also mentioned that he saw a documentary on the issue. It never was because a consumer had said so. And a couple months ago, the State Department did a forum on business and social responsibility and human trafficking and slavery. And the director of global sustainability at Procter & Gamble spoke at one of the panels and talked a lot about their great global governance program in terms of fair sourcing, et cetera, and they were doing a lot of great stuff. And so I asked him, you're doing all this great stuff. I never heard about that from Procter & Gamble. Do you hear from consumers to thank you about the good stuff? And he was visibly disturbed or upset that he does not hear from customers to thank him for the good stuff that they're doing. So I think both on the positive end, like recognizing companies like Eileen Fisher who are doing positive things and putting them on their putting the information on your homepage, but then also addressing companies that you go to every day, like grocery stores that you go to or fast food restaurants that you go to every day, and say, I want to know where those tomatoes come from. I want to see, along with the nutrition information on your website, also want to see your sourcing policy as well. So I think consumers can do a lot more than they are, and I'm hoping that the Supply Chain Transparency Act and other statewide initiatives that are underway will inspire consumers to also take responsibility in their own consumption choices. Other questions?
Hi, I'm Julia Parker with UL and STR. We're an auditing and certification company. I had a question if any of you have been approached or have thought about the work that's going on the other side, the environmental sustainability movement, especially among the U.S. government and their efforts to source from sustainable supply chains. Often in those conversations, and I have been in several of those meetings as well, social justice issues rarely come up. Child labor laws barely come up. I think it's that we already know the U.S. government maybe that they've assumed it's already on their radar screen and they don't want to source from those practices. But they're about to launch a new website on data.gov that's called the Supply Chain Community of Practice. And I was just curious, clearly they want a lot of input from a variety of retailers, manufacturers, suppliers, and NGOs, and you name it, they're trying to collect stakeholders to put insight on how to make sure that the supply chains are as responsible as possible. And I'm curious if any of you have been approached or have thought about those connections to the environmental NGOs or what's going on in that side of the community to have sustainability in the supply chains from that perspective.
I'll see if I understood your question correctly. Are you asking about standards, environmental standards, if you will, that companies or otherwise would expect in addition to the social standards? Is that, am I understanding you correctly?
What I'm asking is how many of you have been engaged in the conversation with the environmental, thinking about the environmental perspective, how these two things are completely linked together, and how we're going to create really socially just supply chains completely all the way through. And so there's a whole bunch of people having that conversation without mentioning the social justice aspect, and then you get a handful of people who say that and go, but social justice is important too, that people look at it. But I'm just curious what your experience has been.
I'll just say, I'll just jump in here and say that definitely in the travel and tourism area, they have embraced the idea of environmental sustainability as something that travel companies must do. And so, in some ways, our work around protection of children from sexual exploitation of children is sort of phase 2 of companies that are much further ahead in being green as far as, completely green, practices, and not yet the social side of having green practices or responsible practices. So we're actually trying to wedge our way into that discussion around environmental sustainability and tourism, that this is another way that companies should be more, that tourism should be more sustainable by their impact on the social life of a community.
Yeah, I would say that for the CIW, that's been the same unfolding process. We recently received, I'm going to butcher the name of the award, but the National Resources Defense Council gave us their annual Going Green Award and created a subject for the award just so that they could give it to us, right? And so I say that not to say look at us, but to say that I think that over the last 5 years, we have had a very large impact in the sustainable food movement and a somewhat smaller, but nonetheless not insignificant impact in the environmental movement, so that those movements are beginning to recognize that food is not sustainable if it was picked by a slave. And it doesn't really matter what chemicals are on it or not on it if it was picked by a slave. And so I don't see it, and it may just be the risk of perspective, but I don't see it so much as as a wedding of the interests, but rather as the environmental movement and, as I said, the sustainable food movement starting to realize that labor force practices are a critical component of what they've been discussing. They just, until a few years ago, didn't realize it.
And I would just add that we definitely look at both environmental and human sustainability issues. And typically for us, historically, our human rights have been prominent in the primary supply, among our primary suppliers, and the environmental issues have been prominent in the secondary and beyond suppliers. And we are increasingly seeing the overlap, such as with the Uzbekistan cotton issue, with our Peru supply chain, which is organic cotton, fair trade, home workers. So it very, the lines are blurring, and it's my dream and hope to have all of it equally integrated throughout the supply chain. It just takes a little time.
Karen?
Hi, my name is Karen Stouse. I'm with Free the Slaves. I have a question, but also wanted to make a comment to the last question, just to watch this space, because Kevin Bales, who was in the video, has finished writing a book about the very thing that everyone has just been talking about, which is the connection between the presence of environmental degradation and the presence of slavery, in particular in environments, and that they're very often coincident. So watch this space. Hopefully that will be published toward the end of this year or early next year. And the goal is to be able to make bridges between the anti-slavery movement and the environmental movement, which in many ways is much further along than the anti-slavery movement as far as pervasiveness of the public conscience. So I do have a question also, which is whether really for any of the panelists, if you can talk about the way that industries coming together can actually help overcome some of the comments that I think Marcus rightly made, that for many companies looking at this on their own, this looks at first blush like something that's not difficult but that is impossible. And I'm wondering if you can talk about examples where industries have come together and made the impossible much more possible. Because one of the industries that I have watched really closely is the electronics and telecommunications industries, who are among those who are subject to the transparency requirements of the DRC conflict of minerals law, and they are literally doing things that they said were impossible, and they're going much further down into their supply chain And the result has been, in some ways, has been for things to happen that looked truly impossible a little while ago. The government of DRC is about as bad as you can imagine a government to be, as far as corruption issues, simple presence on the ground, provision of any type of public services. And yet, in response to that law, the government of Congo, together with the 10 surrounding governments, have made agreements that they will be much more responsible about checking the mines. And it's not, I don't want to exaggerate the degree of success at this point, but the fact that the Congolese government has joined with the United Nations and with Congolese civil society to actually visit mines last summer to look for the presence of child labor. I'm not saying they did a great job of it, but it happened, and that was almost unthinkable, and that was a direct result of the transparency measure. So I'm wondering, anyway, maybe it was more of a comment than a question, but I'm wondering.
I was waiting for the question.
Well, the question is, are there other examples of that, of the way that industries coming together helps them overcome what at first appeared to be impossible things to do?
I don't even think you need the entire industry to come together. You just need enough of the market so that it makes a difference. This is all about money. At the end of the day, there is nothing at play here. There's no morality, this is about money. These are all businesses, and they're in business to make money. And some of them would like to make money in a way that's reputable, and some don't care so much about that. It doesn't matter. They all have one, most of them, if they're publicly traded, have to have this perspective. They're in business to make money. And so if enough of the industry says you can't make money doing it this way anymore, if this way is running slaves or this way is having kids mine minerals, if enough of the business says, sorry, we're not taking that product, then the industry changes, because they're not doing it, as the film said, it's illegal everywhere. It's not some country that says, well, you're exporting your morality. We actually believe in slavery. This is all about money. And if the market shifts so that there isn't money to be made doing that, it won't happen. It won't happen as a rule. You're always going to have somebody cheating. That's the problem. When you have a debased work environment, cheating is slavery. There's no place else to go. If you have a normal work environment, there are lots of ways to cheat before you get to slavery. And people will cheat. That happens in every business. But if there's no place to go but slavery, then the cheaters will do slavery. It's that simple. And so in our business, and I have no clue what percentage of the market we have. We just have 10 large buyers of tomatoes, and they said, you can't do it this way anymore. And now it's in the process of not being done that way anymore. And I would suggest to you that what happened in the Congo is exactly the same thing. Enough companies said, guess what? We actually really care about this now, as in we won't buy your product. And now this really corrupt government, what do they care about? Money. It's all about money. And so they did it, and they will continue to do it.
Go ahead.
I would just add, I think the apparel and footwear industries are perfect examples. Again, going back to the mid-'90s, they've really been under fire and for quite some time, and there's tremendous collaboration amongst those companies. If you look at the FLA, that's the only multi-stakeholder organization that does independent auditing, right? I can't think of any other ones. So I think they've really tackled a great deal of these problems within their supply chain. So it's really a great question, and I think there's a lot of lessons that can be learned from apparel and footwear.
And just to comment, in my world, the code of conduct, companies are coming to us now rather than us trying to beat down their door to sign the code of conduct. And I'm actually having conversations initiated by others in the travel industry that shouldn't this be just an industry standard that companies do these things? And so that was their idea, not mine. So.
And I'd also say that I think you're finding now that, this used to be viewed in many circles as sort of a marketing add-on, a way to get some good PR, even if the CEO really believed it, but I mean, it was marketed a lot. And I think you can obviously still market corporate social responsibility broadly described. And I agree. I mean, I think these days it's a business imperative. And I think what we're seeing is, I can talk about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and, compliance, people are pretty interested, in light of Walmart and things like that. But what really gets them excited and wanting to talk and sit down and asking, hey, can you stay an extra night so we can have a meeting tomorrow, is our issues relating to, for example, the California Transparency and Supply Chains Act. I mean, trying to do it the right way and then also knowing what to do when a problem arises. I mean, that's really what gets, I think, the blood flowing. So in a way, my view of it is just that I wish sometimes you'd also see that side, like the side that I see of companies who really, really want to do the right thing or just trying to figure out how and read sometimes parts of a statute. They say, my God, how can we possibly do that? We really want to do it, but it's just so hard. The companies who are going to be less likely to support these initiatives are going to push back 5 times harder. And that's my point. But I think it sells itself in a sense. I mean, to put it sort of in a commercial way, I mean, a lot of the examples I've heard here, by the way, are free market examples, which is sort of ironic when we're talking about a regulation that's going to be forced on companies. So, a lot of the ways that things work so well are all free market, apparently. But, these are going to definitely, I mean, look, if this bill passes in whatever form, it's going to have a huge impact in the sense of companies are going to be taking notice of this even more than they are now. So that I think is undeniable.
I would just add that I do think these are free market principles. Certainly the Campaign for Fair Food is 100% a free market approach, but free markets depend on information. And if everybody had perfect information, then we'd have a perfectly fair and free market, and we'll never get there. But the more information that people have, then the more you actually have a free market. And so my sense is that certainly that's what happened with us. My client spent 20 years not only bringing, but keeping this issue in front of the public. And with that information, the market shifted. And so my view of a transparency law is exactly that it will provide greater information so that the free market can actually operate in a manner in which Friedman would have wanted.
And I think what's exciting about where we are right now, in terms of the Business Transparency Act and other voluntary or mandated measures, is slavery may have been around since the beginning of commerce as we know it. However, our understanding of it, and especially keeping up with globalization and the measures that we have to take, our understanding is evolving. And because of technology and access to information, we have more opportunities now to get the voices of the workers and any element, any area, any node of the supply chain to the procurement people who make these decisions. And I think we're kind of trying to grasp with that with a policy framework of how do we do that? Is it a mandate? Is it voluntary measures? Is it a combination of both? Well, what if it has to be really punitive? What if it has to be a stick or a carrot, et cetera, et cetera? And that's what the Business Transparency Act, I think, has really helped. And again, when I was at Lexus, even when this was introduced, and it hasn't passed yet, hopefully it will, but even when it was introduced and we were asked to comment upon it, it did inspire our company to take a look at the supplier code of conduct and say, is our human trafficking language tight enough? Could we tweak it to make it better, even if this passes or not? And I believe that has happened. And that's kind of an exciting space where we're at, that we have to catch up to the reality of the ground, and it's these forums and these discussions that are allowing us to do that. Are there other questions? This is 2 hearings with Marina, and she has not asked a question, which I'm very...
Yeah, come on, Marina.
She's under orders.
No, sure.
You had to say that.
Hi, I'm Marina Colby, Expat USA, and I would love to hear more about some examples of really the power of having this bill introduced. And so maybe that goes to Marcus and your clients. And you established this, you said your work within the law firm within the last year, and I would love to hear more about where you see your practice going in this area.
Almost seems like a plant. No, we'll not talk about how great our practice is and how unique our practice is and how much work we can do for clients. I will not talk about those things. Instead, I'll talk about. No,
You want this bill to pass.
sure, right. No, but I think there's a huge amount of awareness now, and I think actually, like the movie we watched, right, things like that bring a huge amount of awareness. I mean, Judge Kendall, federal district judge in Chicago, and I wrote a book together on this topic and child exploitation, and so we find a spike, frankly, whenever there's a TV show, a Nightline, a special on Apple or whatever. That will generate interest in what we do. So I think from the public awareness raising, that is a huge issue. There's no doubt. I mean, the California Transparency Supply Chains Act in many ways animates the practice because that's what people want to learn about, and it's nuanced, and there are nuances to the bill, and they want to learn, how they can, what they need to do the right thing. For example, make sure you have it on your homepage. Right, your disclosure. A lot of companies have great disclosures. They're not on their homepage. That's what the law requires. I mean, a little free legal advice. We do more than that, though. But so I think that's where a lot. And to the issue earlier about sustainability more generally, I think you'll look at a lot of clients or a lot of businesses. They're going to have sustainability disclosures that are going to cover everything, and then they might even incorporate the California Act disclosure within that. And I think I work with people in our environmental group, people in our labor group. Depending on the particulars of a particular case, particular challenge, we try to work together because they have expertise that I don't. I'm more of an investigator. I know a lot about trafficking issues, but they know a lot about the particulars of an environmental statute that they need to abide by. So I think you're finding, I'm sure you see the same thing, you're going to find much more collaboration as we view this as not just a very simple write a nice policy, put a bow on it, make it real long, and just stick it somewhere in the website. Companies are taking this seriously, and when they have a problem, they call investigators. And investigators, that's what we do, right? We go out and we interview people, and we dig, and we get an answer. And we then tell them, here's the problem, here's what we found out, here's what we think you should do now. And so that's where I think you're going to find things going.
And I think one thing we don't realize is that about 80 or 90%, I would venture to guess, of procurement decisions are made at kind of a mid-operational level in a company, at a manager or a senior manager or a director level. And they are literally looking at online databases about information about a company that they're about to give $1 million, $2 million, $4 million, $5 million contract with. And right now they're already looking at credit scores. They're looking at politically exposed folks. They're looking at some corruption standards. They're looking for negative news articles to see what is the indication of risk. Right now, no one is really looking systematically at human rights information. And I do think, like this bill, like California, that is starting to seep up in companies at that operational level of, well, we also should be taking a look at human rights, especially because now we have the Department of Labor that publishes a list of if you're sourcing such and such in cotton from Uzbekistan or from India, et cetera, it could be made by child or forced labor. So let's pay more attention to that. So I do believe that regardless, I do think, and I hope the bill passes, but regardless if it does or not, it has, I think, started a very serious conversation in the industry about looking at human rights as an indicator. And that has to do with this legislation, has to do with advocates, has to do with investment funds that are looking at this as well.
And just to follow up on that, it's a great point because I think, and sort of take that point one step further, if you are manager, imagine you're the head of compliance in a big company, Fortune 500 company, and all of a sudden an Apple-like scandal arises under your watch. Maybe 2 years ago you could say, you know what, I never even thought of that. I mean, that was just completely outside of my frame of reference. It's very hard now as a person in compliance to say, human trafficking, I never thought a supplier possibly could have a child or a human traffic victim being used and exploited. You're not going to find that. So therefore, when the scandal hits, and this is to the point about Facebook, right? When the scandal hits, whether that's a scandal by legal means or these days more likely a consumer class action, you do not want to be the person in charge of the compliance department when that scandal hits because you have nowhere to really go. I mean, you have to either admit, boy, I really don't know what's going on in the compliance world these days, or I just didn't care about it. Now, that's not to say a scandal can't hit when it's something that fell through the cracks. Some person, some rogue supplier engages in misconduct. But I'm talking about sort of systemic problems. It's just, I think that's going to have a huge effect too, because as compliance professionals learn about this, they realize, they're self-interested. We're all self-interested. They don't want to have this sort of horrible thing happen when they're on their watch, and a thing that they probably very much find personally embarrassing and care about. So I think that's also going to be, that's part of the awareness raising. It just, when the CEO comes to visit you and says, man, I just read the New York Times and I saw this huge article, And what did we do? What, had anyone ever talked about that? And they say, well, no, actually, Samir's company was here and did a presentation, but we never did anything about it. That's not, you don't want to be that guy.
Start packing your bags.
Right.
Start finding another job.
Start planning your time off.
Any other questions?
I want to make another comment just at the end here, that first of all, I just want to start from the premise that I actually don't think that there is such a thing as a free market anywhere in this world or country. But I also think that this bill might be ahead of its time, but that it will really eventually become mainstream for companies to do this. And that so it's out there now, there's a discussion around it, it's controversial, there will be pushback about it, but I actually think that it is the way we are going, and that it will eventually really highly impact our entire world. I say that partly from the perspective of having worked on the issue of sexual exploitation of children for 20 years, when 20 years ago we couldn't talk about it, nobody was doing anything, there were no laws, certainly there was no private sector involvement, and we are so far along. And I actually see this as the next coming down the pike issue, and that this will eventually pass in some form, and that companies will eventually comply. So that's my final say.
Thank you, Carol. That was very nice. I do want to say, before we wrap up, I want to thank Karen Staus, because as far as I can tell, you put a ton of work into all of today's program, so thank you very much. A big hand for Karen. And also a big thank you to the Attest Alliance that's been working here in D.C. in this building for many, many years on anti-trafficking issues. And that does point us to what I think is the big elephant in this entire building, is the reauthorization of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which is landmark U.S. legislation that actually authorizes all of federal government programming and funding for anti-trafficking measures, from law enforcement to services. And like many things this time around, it's being stalled in Congress. I would urge everyone that's watching this through the web and everyone here to really contact your legislator and say we need to pass and reauthorize the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And if you haven't already done so, if you look at roll call today, there is a great opinion piece by Senators Leahy and Rubio about trafficking and how it is a bipartisan, multi-faith issue as well, and how we all need to get behind it. It's a great piece. I do suggest and encourage everyone to look at it. I think Ambassador Mark Lagon would have been very happy with this panel, and that's what I'm going to report to him. Hopefully he'll get back into town safely at sometime soon today. But thank you very much to a great audience. Thank you for everyone on the web who's been watching. And thank you so much to this great panelist for providing such diverse opinions and views on this topic.
And thank you to Maggie Doherty, without whom I have no doubt this would not have come together.
Yeah, please.
Well,
Want my mic?
I'm sorry. Say hi to everyone. Okay, I'll sit down. Hi to everyone out on the web, but everyone here who doesn't know me. I'm Maggie Doherty. I work for Senator Rubio. I helped put this together with Karen and Senator Cardin's office, and just thank you everyone for coming. This is a subject matter that has been getting really hot in the Senate lately. We had a hearing touching upon the TVPRA in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee earlier this week. We had the roll call, so it's been a really good week for trafficking awareness, and I really want to continue this push. And if any of you guys have any questions about, what's going on the Hill, trafficking-wise, feel free to contact me, because I like to talk to everyone about what's going on, because that way I can ignore other parts of my job. Hopefully my boss isn't watching. But yeah, so thank you everyone for coming out today.
Okay, thanks.